Previously on Bourbon Moth Woodworking. I designed this hutch on the computer and then I decided to make it. So I glued up some MDF that was going to be my legs and I wrapped them in some white oak and then I made this. It's kind of the end cap thing and I made it extra deep because it's going to have secret storage in it. And then I made another end cap and I connected them with a bunch of pieces of wood like this, and then I put a secret door in the end cap to hide the secret storage area, but I had to figure out a way to open it without actually letting people know that you could open it, so I came up with this thing. And that's kind of where we left off. You reach under here, pull the wire, open the secret door, and now we just got to finish the rest of the hutch. So up until this point, the hutch has kind of just been a big rectangle. Now, I mentioned in the previous video that my wife wants this to look like something that came out of an old rustic farm home in France or something like that. So I need to do some things to elevate the design and make it look a little fancier, Frenchier, French fancier, whatever. So I thought some corbels could do the trick. I started out by cutting some solid pieces of 1-inch thick white oak, and I took them over to my shaper station and I designed this oval looking thing. And then I started cutting it out. Now this isn't going to make sense right away, but just wait a second and I'll lift up the shaper and you can see a bunch of pieces of Tylenol stacked on top of each other. But don't worry, I have a plan. Popped out my bourbon blade, I freed it from the shaper station, and it looked like this. Now believe it or not, this is not one but two corbels. So I took it over to my chop saw and I cut it in half. Now this is kind of what I was thinking, but it'll look a lot better actually on the hutch. Here, let me show you. So I'm going to put one on the outside corner like this and one on the inside corner like that. Yeah? Maybe? I don't know. Still seems like it's missing something. I decided to abandon that idea for now. I'll come back to that later and try and do something to the base. Now, again, it's pretty flat and it needed some sort of trim. So I went over to the table saw and I ripped down some 3/4 white oak, and then I pulled out a fancy router bit. I'm calling it a fancy router bit because I really don't know what else to call it. It's a router bit that's kind of like a roundover, but it gives a fancier roundover with some different ledges and stuff. Somebody out there in the comment section, tell me what that thing's called. Anywho, once I used the fancy router bit to make some fancy base trim, I laid the entire hutch down on some boards to elevate it up off the ground, and I gave the entire thing a thorough sanding. I had to do this myself because Craig was on vacation, which is pretty rude considering I sanded his entire project for him. Once I had the piece laid down and nicely sanded, I grabbed my fancy trim, I laid it on the front, and I marked out where I needed to cut miters for my ends so that it would wrap around both sides. I marked this out with the bourbon blade. Second time I've mentioned it in this video. Hint, hint, available at bourbonmoth.com. Then I went over to my miter saw and I cut some nice 45-degree angles on both ends of that trim piece. Laid it on top of the hutch, and then I cut end pieces that, like I said, would wrap around the sides. Now this is just to elevate the base look. You see it's got a nice kind of Frenchy look now. Maybe? Is that a thing? I don't know. Anyways, once I was happy with how all my pieces were fitted together with those nice tight miters, I clamped them to make sure they wouldn't move around, and then I started smearing glue all over the place. Now you might be thinking, isn't this a lot of wood that you're adding onto this piece? I mean, that's going to increase the weight significantly. And you are absolutely right. You see, the problem is I halfway design my pieces, which means I get the general shape on SketchUp and then I make the rest up as I go, which sometimes means I use more wood than I probably need to. I mean, the end result is the same. I get the overall look, but yeah. This thing's gonna be heavy. Pretty soon I had all those pieces glued and clamped onto the base of the cabinet, and I was pretty happy with how everything was looking. But what I wasn't happy with was these corbels. I just thought they were a little too plain. They needed something else. So I cut a backer plate with a nice chamfer on the end of it, and I thought that elevated the look quite a bit. So I took my original corbel, added a little glue, clamped it up, and now I had an elevated corbel that looks different. I don't know. Anyways, by the time I got those all glued up, it was time to take the clamps off of my base trim because that was all dry, and we could finally see how this was going to look once I put all those clamps away. Now, my miters were pretty darn good, but not perfect. There was just a hairline crack on one of them, so I took a little glue, smeared it into that crack, and then I just used the rod of a screwdriver, ran it along that sharp edge, and you can actually kind of fold the corner over and glue it to itself and close that gap up. Once you do this and give it a quick sanding, nobody's ever gonna know that you messed your miter up a little bit. Except for all you people watching, because I just told you. Anyways, once my miters were exactly the way I wanted them to be, I sanded everything up and I reoriented the hutch into the right position. By that time, my decorative corbel things were dry, so I took those out of clamps and it was time to hook them onto the hutch. Now, I didn't want to wait around for glue to dry while I had these all clamped up, so I decided to use a combination of CA glue and wood glue. Basically, the wood glue is going to make sure it's incredibly strong, and the CA glue is going to act as the clamp to hold it in place while the wood glue dries. Just put a perimeter of CA glue around the outside, the wood glue on the inside, sprayed some activator spray on the hutch, and boom goes the dynamite. Corbels installed. I added them to the front, to the side, to the back of the side, and slowly but surely this was going from a plain rectangular cube to a elevated Frenchy rectangular cube. Believe me, I really think this is going to look good when it's all done. It's a process. We'll get there. After getting those corbels installed, I thought that the middle section of the hutch was a little lacking. So I made some little miniature corbels and I glued them above each one of the dividers just to kind of tie in the entire design and keep that fancy elevated look going. I used that same CA glue and wood glue trick. I cleaned up the little bit of squeeze out I got with the Bourbon blade. That's 3 mentions now, available at bourbonmoth.com. But I still thought it needed something else. So I measured the distance in between my decorative corbels and I made some more fancy trim with that fancy router bit. This time I made just a small little pencil trim, for lack of a better word. It looked something like this. And I cut pieces to size to fit in between each one of those decorative accents. Kind of like this. Yes, still adding more wood and more weight to this piece. I'm well aware that at some point I'm going to have to pick this thing up and move it in the house. But that's tomorrow Jason's problem. We don't worry about those things until the piece is completely done. I finished off the decorative trim around the entire top of the cabinet, all the way along the front in between those corbels, and I even did it on the side, just so everything was nice and matchy-matchy. I wonder how many times I can say decorative corbel in one video. Maybe we could make this a drinking game. Every time Jason says decorative corbel, you take a drink of whiskey. Starting right now. Once I made sure that all of my fancy trim fit correctly, I added some glue and these bandy clamps to hold it in place until the glue dried. These bandy clamps are pretty handy. In fact, I like to call them handy bandy clamps because they're so handy. The next morning I came out to the shop, removed all the handy bandies, and thought everything was starting to look pretty nice. But I was tired of working on the ground down on my knees. I am getting pretty old. So I wanted to lift the entire thing up onto sawhorses, but as I already mentioned, Craig was on vacation and this thing was already pretty darn heavy. So I scratched my noggin, thought a bit, decided I needed a better place to hold on to, so I removed the end door panels. Then I had a nice handle and I just heaved it up there. and it was just as heavy as it looks. But I managed to get it elevated high enough to slide a sawhorse under one end, and then once it was on that end, I mean, at that point it was kind of just a giant teeter-totter, so I was able to hoist the other side up and slide a sawhorse under that end as well. Now I can work in a standing position instead of squatting down like a weirdo. Remember, work smarter, not harder. Now, if you remember the last video, or the video that I built the cabinet doors for this piece, we're finishing the entire thing with this Rubio Monocoat pre-aging. Now, as I mentioned in the previous videos, we're finishing it with this even though Rubio Monocoat says this is not a finish, meaning it's not going to give a lick of protection to the piece. What it's going to do is change the color. The way it works is a chemical reaction with the tannins in the wood to make it a nice aged grayish color. And then I'll finish it with some wax paper just like I did the doors, because I'm not too worried about protection. It's not going to be in a high traffic area. Once I had everything pre-aged to make my life easier, we had to figure out a bottom on this piece, because if you don't have a bottom, well, the stuff's just going to fall out and be all over the ground, and well, that wouldn't be a very good hutch. So over to the table saw, and I started ripping down some pieces of 3/4 inch oak. Now the way that I decided to install the bottom is a little unconventional, but as I mentioned before, it's because I don't fully design pieces. I just kind of get the shape and then make things up on the fly. So I'm basically going to create some little brace pieces and just insert a shelf of 3/4 inch veneered plywood in each section to create the bottom. My initial thought behind this was this will allow me to remove those bottom panels and make the piece a lot lighter when I carry it in the house. But as you're going to see here in a little bit, I changed my mind on that and just decided to glue them in place. But I don't want to spoil the rest of the video for you. Anyways, I cut down some 3/4 inch pieces of veneered plywood to the right size. I made sure they all fit in each of the sections, and then I added some glue to lock them in permanently so that I was gonna have to carry that weight no matter what, because I'm an idiot. With all of my bottom panels in place, I had to figure out a way to install the back panel. Now for the back panel, I'm going to be using 1/4 inch veneered plywood, but it needs a little lip to rest on so that it's not just floating there on the back. So I cut a bunch more pieces of scrap oak and I glued them around the perimeter of each one of my openings on the back to create a nice shelf. This will give me the perfect surface to mount that back panel to, add a couple screws, and this will be removable to make it easier to carry the piece. See, I had some good ideas. While I waited for the glue to dry on those pieces, it was time to start working on some long pieces to make my top out of. Now this is where I was really bummed that Craig was still on vacation, because have you ever tried to wrestle 10-foot boards through a 6-foot joiner by yourself? Yeah, it's pretty hard to do, and my arms were incredibly tired afterwards. But somehow I managed to get a fairly straight edge on one side of each of my boards. I ripped them down to the correct width on the table saw, and I planed them down to the right thickness over on my planer. Then it was time to glue the whole thing together. Now a smart man would have added some dominoes to help with the alignment, because the piece is really long. But if you've been watching this video for any length of time, you probably already know I am not a smart man. So I just added some glue to all those seams and hoped and prayed I could get the seams to line up. And when I say get the seams to line up, what I mean is beat the crud out of them with a large hammer until they do what I want them to do. Lucky for me, I actually managed to get all the seams pretty darn close, which is saying something. I was just really tired after all that. So with my top and clamps, I went back over to the hutch carcass and I measured for my back panels. I was pretty happy that it was pretty uniform all the way across the back there, height-wise. So I went over to the table saw and I started ripping down sheets of 1/4 inch plywood. Once I had them cut to size, I stuck it on the back of the hutch. Because of the overall length of the hutch, I'm going to have to do 3 separate panels. So I decided the best way to break it up was one bigger middle panel and then two smaller side panels. I countersunk some holes and then I added some screws to hold that panel in nice and tight. Then, while I was thinking about it, I decided I should probably drill some holes in those middle compartments to allow me to get cords through the back and plug in all the TV equipment. So I drilled a small hole through one side, drilled halfway through with the Forstner bit, went around to the other side and finished off the hole so I wouldn't get any blowout. And then I remembered I never screwed in that little panel on the very end of the cabinet. Oops. But I got all my holes drilled eventually, and we were on to the next step, which was to pour another large cup of the Rubio Monocoat pre-aging and douse all the pieces I had cut so far. Now you'll notice looking at the piece that it is still very wet. This pre-aging serum takes about 24 hours to dry and get to its final color. So don't be concerned when you're looking at the piece and you're like, oh yuck, that's all blotchy and gross. It won't be when it dries. Just calm down. I just didn't want to wait around for the pieces to be dry and I installed them all wet. Now these middle two sections are going to have doors and I want there to be a shelf halfway up, right on the divider of the door. So the lower part of the shelf can have all the ugly TV stuff that you don't want to see, and then up above where the glass is, you can have all the fancy stuff, you know, the decoration things that your wife buys and you're not allowed to touch. So I had to install a shelf right in the middle of that door. So I cut down some more scrap pieces of white oak, I countersunk some holes in there, and then I cut a piece of plywood to use as just a little spacer to set those braces exactly where I wanted them. I just plopped them on top of that piece of plywood and I screwed them into my 3/4 inch plywood dividers. Zip zap zoop, and we were ready to make our shelves. To make the shelves, I ripped down some more pieces of 3/4 inch Riffs-On ply, and then I just faced it with a solid piece of Riffs-On 3/4 inch wood. I said that really funny, but I still had plywood on the brain, and sometimes you just start speaking and you don't know where you're going to end up, and then you just say things. Anyways, I used that same trick with the glue and the CA glue to lock it in place, and I gave them a nice sanding. And then, like everything else on this project, I lubed them up with some more Rubio Monocoat pre-aging. This color is authentic number 2, in case you were wondering. They do have multiple colors of that pre-aging liquid. Then I went over to the piece and just double checked that my shelves were gonna fit where I wanted them to, and they did. That would have been really embarrassing if they didn't, like I'd show you anyways. By that time, the glue on my top panel was all dry, so I took it out of clamps and then I used my track saw to zip zap zoop the ends down to the correct size, getting them all nice and square. There was a little crack on this end of the piece that I did end up having to stabilize with a little CA glue. I just didn't bother filming that part because I didn't think it was important until just now when I realized you could see the crack on camera. Anyways, I sanded down the entire top and then I added a 1/2 inch roundover to the top and bottom on 3 sides, not the back because that's going to be against the wall, to make it nice and soft and match the rest of the piece. And then you guessed it, more of the Rubio Monocoat pre-aging. The nice thing about this stuff is it's so liquidy that it goes on really quick and easy. And as long as you're not really careless, you can get it pretty evenly over the entire piece, and it looks pretty awesome when it dries. Like this. Everything's nice and uniform. All I had to do was carry this gigantic top over there and hope that the sawhorses aren't going to give out at any moment. Which thankfully they did not. And with the top done, it was time to move on to drawers.
This video is sponsored by BetterHelp. Now, BetterHelp is awesome because it connects you with a licensed therapist and allows you to talk to somebody. And I know you might be thinking, well, I don't need to talk to somebody. Well, my dad actually struggled with depression for years, and he didn't tell anybody in the family for a long time. And when he finally opened up that he needed to talk to somebody and he found somebody to talk to, he became a different person. He was around more as a father, he was around more as a husband, and it was the best decision that he ever made. So if you're needing someone to talk to, well, BetterHelp is a great place to start. The hardest decision is, well, making the decision that it would be helpful to talk to somebody. And that can be a big hurdle because where do you even find somebody to talk to? And that's why I love BetterHelp, because it's as simple as going to their website, betterhelp.com/bourbonmoth. You answer a few questions and they'll connect you with a professional who's got years of experience dealing with problems just like the ones that you need to talk to someone about. If you feel like you're struggling or you just need someone to talk to, you don't have to struggle alone. Let our sponsor BetterHelp connect you with a professional that's right for you, all from the comfort of your own home. You see, that's the great thing about BetterHelp, is they got a lot of different ways to talk to somebody. Whether that's a video call, phone call, messaging, you can choose what's most comfortable for you. So go to betterhelp.com/bourbonmoth or click the link down in the video description and get a special discount off your first month. Huge thanks to BetterHelp for sponsoring this video.
Before I could start making my drawer boxes and drawer faces, I needed to get my drawer slides installed. Now, whenever I'm installing multiple drawer slides in multiple boxes, I like to cut these templates to use to lay out the height of my slides. I cut one piece of plywood for each different slide height, and this ensures that they are perfectly level and straight and the exact same height on both sides of my box. The only thing is you have to start with the highest slide first, or else you're not going to be able to get your next templates in there because the slide would be in the way. So you start at the top and you work your way down. Your last one should rest right on the bottom, if you're doing it the way that I'm doing it. And then once you get one side done, you just do the exact same thing over on the other side, and now you have a perfectly mirrored version of the first slides you put in. And everything should be all lined up, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Next, it was time to make my drawer boxes. Now, in the past, I have been a huge fan of just nailing together some drawer boxes out of Baltic birch, because I'm usually making a ton of cabinets for like a laundry room or a storage compartment, and I just don't care. But since I put so much effort into this piece already, I just didn't think that Baltic birch drawer boxes would match the overall vibe. So I decided to use solid 5/8 white oak. So after cutting down all of my drawer box pieces, I went over to the table saw and I dadoed out a nice groove into all of the pieces that will catch the bottom panel of my drawer. Now, because white oak is a pretty hard wood, I couldn't just brad nail these boxes together like I do with Baltic birch. So I was gonna have to do something a little different that would also match the aesthetics of the overall piece. So I'm gonna do a fake dowel joinery. If you don't know what that means, well, I'm going to show you. Basically, I made a little jig to mark out even spaces on all of the side pieces of my drawer boxes. Then I went over to the drill press and using a 3/8 inch Forstner bit, I drilled into each end right on those marks about 3/8 of an inch. Then I took all of my pieces and I used CA glue to hook them together. That's right, just some super glue. But don't worry, that's not all that I'm going to use to hook them together. Once I had all of my boxes hooked together, see how quick this is because I'm just using super glue? Now we can actually join them together the way we're going to join them together, which is with screws. I started out by pre-drilling all of those holes that I drilled with the Forstner bit into my side panels, and then I sunk in some 1.25 inch screws. Now the screws are going to lock these boxes together and make them incredibly strong. The only drawback is, well, screws are ugly and you don't want to be embarrassed when your friends come over and look at the piece and they're like, "You just screwed these together? What a loser." So you want to hide the fact that you used screws. So I went over to my drill press and using this CMT plug cutter, also available on my website, I drilled some 3/8 inch black walnut plugs. I know, black walnut, but you don't have black walnut anywhere else in the entire piece. I'm well aware of this, but I needed something darker that would contrast the white oak and not just get lost, because I want people to look at these drawers and be like, "Wow, you used dowels to hook all these together? You must be a real woodworker." I mean, they don't have to know that there's screws underneath those little pieces of walnut. So walnut it was. After gluing each one of my plugs in place, I cut them down with a flush cut saw and then I sanded them smooth. And I thought they looked pretty nice. Then I cut some panels to size, slid them in the back, and started drilling all my various holes for my Blum clip thingies. I use this little jig. It's called the Jigget. I think I got it at Rockler or somewhere. I'll include a link in the video description, but it works really well to pre-drill out for your clips and your holes in the back that lock into your drawer slide. Anyways, I added my orange clips and then I drilled some holes in the back panel to lock it in place so that that wasn't accidentally sliding out. And I just added a few little screws, just little tiny ones. You don't need much. And then I carried all the drawers over to the cabinet just to make sure they were gonna fit. And I got that satisfying click for each one of my boxes. And as you can see, the action on these Bloom slides is just unbeatable. And those drawer boxes look pretty good too. And as long as you don't tell anybody, nobody has to know there's screws in there. Then it was time to start on the drawer faces. And I'm gonna tell you right now, this is where not planning ahead really came back to bite me. I started out by rough cutting down some more riffs on oak. I went over to the joiner to get a nice flat edge, and then I planed it down, and then I cut it to the right size and shape. I went over and I tested all the pieces in my box, and sure enough, the reveals around all of them were fantastic. All I had to do was come up with a simple wooden pole for the front of each drawer face. And that's where I went insane. First, I was like, wouldn't it be really cool if I hogged out a nice oval shape in the front of each drawer face that looked like this? Ooh, that's fancy. And then I was like, wouldn't it also be cool if I made gigantic poles that perfectly recessed into that oval so it looked very integrated and cool? So I made this pole thing. I rounded over the outside edge with a 1/2 inch roundover. Looked like this. And as you can see, this shape perfectly fits into my recessed oval. And you're like, yeah, but how could you hold on to that? Well, then I took it over to my bandsaw and very carefully, I cut it perfectly in half. Because what I have here is actually not one, but 2 drawer poles that I made at the same time. So being very careful so that both drawer poles were even, I cut a line down the middle, and just like that, now I have 2 scoop drawer poles that look something like this. So I went over and I glued them in my drawer panels, and I hated them. I don't know about you, but this looks so dumb. I mean, I like the idea for the drawer poles, just not for this piece. It didn't match at all. So literally, after about 5 or 6 hours of working on those, I threw them all in the scrap bin and I started over. This time I decided to keep things very simple. I used the same concept to make my scoops. But unlike those big behemoths I made the first time, these ones were much smaller. I used some double-sided tape to stick it to a piece of scrap wood so that I could add that 1/2 inch roundover around the perimeter. And then I took it over to the bandsaw, and once again I cut it down the middle so that I could get 2 scoops out of the deal. Once I had 8 of them made, I gave them all a good sanding so that they were nice and smooth and felt good on your fingers, and then it was time to make new drawer faces. Now I wanted to elevate the drawer faces slightly, but I didn't want anything over the top. So I thought a simple piece of rift sawn white oak with a nice raised border would actually match the look of the doors quite nicely. So again, I used my same CA glue and wood glue trick, making sure to be very minimal on my glue usage. I didn't want a bunch of squeeze out that I had to clean up, and I purposely put the glue towards the bottom of the seam rather than the top. I double stuck taped this nice square to my table saw so that I could get everything lined up, and I just slowly worked my way through all those panels until I had 8 of them made. Just placing each piece on there one at a time. Now all I had to do was hook my scoops to my drawer face. Because I was going to have to do 8 of these, I took the time to make this little jig out of plywood that would allow me to get each scoop perfectly lined up in the dead center of each panel. All you do is hook it on the end and plop your scoop right where it needs to go. Once again, used that same old CA glue and wood glue trick because I don't got time to wait around for clamps, and sprayed a little activator spray and stuck that piece on there. And this looks much nicer and much cleaner than my previous drawer faces. And I only wasted a day making 2 sets. That's not too bad. Once I had all 8 drawer faces done, I lathered them up with another coat of that Rubio Monocoat pre-aging, and this cabinet was pretty close to done. I mean, sure, I still have to mount the drawer faces and the cabinet doors, but because I'm going to have to move this out of the shop, I didn't see any reason to do that in my shop. In fact, I wanted to make this thing as light as humanly possible, because we got a long ways to carry it. So I removed all the drawer boxes, I removed the shelves. Craig was finally back from vacation, so he helped me take the top off. I removed the back panels, and I would have removed those bottom panels, but like a moron, I glued them in place. I even thought about taking the drawer slides out, but I really didn't want to have to put them back in.
Okay, so the piece is essentially built. I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty heavy, and it's 10 feet long. But that's okay, because all we have to do is carry it out of my shop, through the garage door, in between the truck and the Airstream, up these stairs, through the front door, through the living room, make this hard 90-degree turn, up this first set of stairs, onto this landing, watching out for the ceiling here, up the second set of stairs, onto the second landing, around the corner, and then up this last set of stairs. Oh boy. Let's do this.
What? I mean, I thought about doing all that stuff, but then I also thought it would be a lot easier if we just brought it through the window upstairs. I mean, it's not that hard to rent a scissor lift. You just make a few phone calls, pay $700, and boom, a scissor lift just arrives at your door. And they don't even ask any questions like, do you know how to drive this? Or what are you going to do with it? They just let you have it, as long as you're willing to pay for it. So between me, Craig, and my neighbor Brandon, we managed to wrestle the entire hutch into the back of the scissor lift. And then with me at the wheel, I very carefully drove it out of the shop and across the yard to the back side of our house, where we just had to go up to the second floor and wiggle it through that itty bitty window up there. So again, very carefully, I approached the side of the house, trying really hard not to break a window or drop the piece of furniture that I just spent 2 weeks building. Before long, I was at the window. And as you can see, we've got plenty of room. This thing should slide right in there. In fact, I'm just gonna drive it right through the window because I've got over 30 minutes logged on the scissor lift. I think I know what I'm doing. So with me and/or the scissor lift pushing on the outside, and Brandon and Craig pulling on the inside, trying hard not to drag it too much across the windowsill, we slowly managed to work the piece of furniture through the window and into our upstairs bonus room. To be completely honest, this whole thing made me really second guess whether or not we actually need stairs. I mean, scissor lifts would be way cooler to get upstairs and downstairs. I mean, if you eliminated all the stairs in our house and I had to go outside in the pouring rain, climb on a scissor lift just to go upstairs, I still wouldn't be too upset about it. It'd actually be pretty fun. So maybe if I ever build a house, no stairs, just scissor lifts. I also want to take this moment to give a huge thanks to my neighbor Brandon, who was so willing to come over and help us do something Really strange, but effective. And just like that, the piece was out of my shop and where it will probably be for the rest of my life. I mean, there's no way I'm gonna haul it back out the window. If we move, well, this thing's staying right where we set it, which is against the wall and under the TV. So with the hard part done, I mean, I really don't think anything could be harder than what we just did. All I really had to do was mount the doors and drawer faces. I purposely left the back off the cabinet until I got the doors mounted because that way I could just reach in from the back and screw the hinges in place. I realized I forgot to put a little tab in the center of the opening where the doors go to act as a catch for the doors. So I ran out to the shop, made 2 of those, and just CA glued them in place. Then I got my other set of doors mounted, and they all fit very nicely, considering I made the doors about 2 months before I made the actual hutch. I got that back panel slapped on there, scooted it against the wall, got my cords run for all the TV components, and then I started installing the drawer faces. Now I already knew they were going to fit because I tested all the fits in my shop, and boy do I like these so much better than those original ugly drawer faces I made. It just goes to show you that sometimes simple is better, and I think these match the overall look I'm going for on this piece much, much better than, well, we're not going to talk about those first ones. Next, I grabbed my top and set that in place, and I didn't really show this in the video, but I mortised out some little holes with the domino joiner so that I could attach the top to the base with Z-clip fasteners. You've probably seen me use those in previous videos. So, while I attached the top to the base with the Z-clip fasteners, I installed my shelves, installed my secret door panels on the ends, and the piece was complete. I've built a lot of pieces of furniture in my life, so this is going to be kind of a bold statement, but this might be my favorite piece so far. There were so many interesting and detailed elements to this piece that took a long time to figure out, but that's what makes it fun, starting a project that you're not quite sure how you're going to accomplish and then seeing it through to the end.
Whew. I'm not gonna lie, there was a moment there where I thought there was no way in heck we were getting this upstairs. And that's when I remembered the scissor lift. Remember that guy from when we did the treehouse? Yeah, those things come in handy. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed that video. Check the links down in the video description. We got products and stuff that we use down there. There's a link to our Bourbon blade. If you haven't signed up for the pre-orders on the Bourbon blade, batch 2 is almost here, and we're getting pretty close to being sold out of batch 2, so get yours now. There's also a link down there for Patreon. If you're not signed up for Patreon, well, you're missing out, because we did a ton of behind-the-scenes footage, like how the scissor lift tipped over on one of the tries. Yeah, you didn't get to see that because you're not a patron. And you're not going to know whether or not I'm lying unless you sign up on Patreon and you go check it out. So I'm not even going to tell you if that's true or not. Anyways, I'm going to sit here and turn on the TV and fall asleep. Oh, man.